Jumbo. Good morning, everybody. We are here this morning to talk about the history of the reparations movement in the United States. I'm Dr. David Horn. I am a professor at California State University at Northridge and the founder of the Reparations United Front, headquartered in Los Angeles, California. Reparations is what we would call an old soul. It is an issue that has been around as long as African Americans have been in the United States. Reparations is about repatriation. Reparations is about going back. Reparations is about responsibility, accountability. Reparations is about giving some kind of recognition, acknowledgement to slaves, to folk who worked without being compensated. Reparations is about providing some apology, atonement, and possibly some kind of compensation for the unrequited work. There have been various definitions of reparations, but essentially they have all come back to there is a part of the United States status quo such that whites get privileges simply because they're white, and black Americans generally get discriminated against, or they get unfair treatment just because they're black. Those who are in the reparations movement see that relationship as a consequence of the unrequited labor of African Americans. That once America established antebellum slavery, what African Americans created was a set of profit-making entities for other people, so that whites gained what we now call unjust enrichment. White privileges are based on the unjust enrichment provided by slave labor that was not compensated for. So most of the reparations arguments that we have utilized from the 19th century until now have been about slavery. Some have also been about the slave trade. We need to understand that there should be a separation between the two. Compensation or some kind of reparations arrangement because of the slave trade is not the same as compensation or some kind of arranged acknowledgement for the unpaid labor of those who were enslaved. Two different issues. They are joined, but they're not the same thing. When we talk about reparations for the slave trade, we are talking about dealing with France, dealing with England, dealing with Spain, and we are talking about the United States before it was the United States. We are not talking about being able to focus our efforts on U.S. government involvement. There was no U.S. government prior to 1776. So to talk about 400 years of the slavery and the slave trade, and we need compensation or some kind of reparations arrangement about 400 years of slavery and the slave trade is not historically accurate, and it's not something we can actually make compelling legal cases about. So even though the reparations movement in its various manifestations have talked about the Ma'afa, the transatlantic slave trade, and slavery as one big thing, it should not be looked upon that way to be implementable. If we intend to win reparations, then we have to understand what is winnable and what's not. But that's another discussion about a strategic reparations plan that'll come in another setting. In terms of talking about the history of the reparations movement in this country, and that is a movement, It's a long-standing movement that has had peaks and valleys that for a while looked like it disappeared, then it came back, and there was a lot of energy, a lot of enthusiasm, and then it faded too. So there's been a lot of ups and downs in the reparations movement. Frederick Douglass in the 1850s and 1860s, who was not originally a supporter of reparations, even though he had been a slave himself and had escaped and had become, the man who has been so instrumental in African American history. Frederick Douglass eventually understood the logic of some kind of support and compensation, apology, and taking care of African Americans. The Civil War didn't do it, Reconstruction didn't do it, and so what you had was a freedom that we were given, and freedom being given there's always a problem with that. You had a freedom that we were given without any way of providing economic independence. We really were not provided a methodology to be able to make it on our own in American society. That whole issue about land, and African Americans have always been close to the land. We've always been grounded in dealing with land. That issue about land was never properly worked out, even though we've had discussions about 40 acres and a mule, which is really a myth. That promise was never really made. We still should have been given land and implements to develop the land, and that was never provided. Every time an opportunity came up to do that, they did something else. The issue then that Frederick Douglass focused on was, once African Americans were free, quote unquote free, based on the 13th Amendment, what about the wherewithal to be able to become economically self-sufficient? What about the wherewithal to be able to make it, to make a living? Simply saying that slavery is over and now you can walk around and do what you want clearly did not work. That was the basis for Jim Crowism and the initial focus on what has now become, as Eric Alexander said, the new Jim Crow, or the reestablishment of mass incarceration for African Americans. Part of Jim Crow was to put African Americans back on the land in servile conditions. You didn't have to call them slaves if they produced the same stuff, if you had the same relationship. So we had tenant farming, we had sharecropping, and we had vagrancy laws, which were used to summarily arrest African Americans and put them into plantation-like conditions to work for some corporation or some company that was paying the sheriff or paying the police department off to go out and arrest black folk. So you started this whole groundswell of putting African Americans into control of law enforcement that we still see now in 2014. The idea that the 13th Amendment, which effectively ended slavery, not Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, but the idea that the 13th Amendment ended slavery. When you read the next line after slavery is banned in the United States, it's prohibited in the United States, the next line says, except when incarcerated. So we have a legal foundation for simply arresting African Americans and returning them to slavery. You didn't necessarily need any probable cause. The probable cause was you're black and you were walking around, or you look like you are not working for somebody else, therefore you can work for or within the legal establishment. We will arrest you and seize your labor, your free labor, for one of these corporations that simply pay the law enforcement money. So part of the reparations movement grew out of that relationship, and Frederick Douglass's support of reparations was based upon that freedom without a viable way to achieve economic self-sufficiency did not really make a whole lot of sense. So Frederick Douglass became an early advocate for reparations. But the real reparations movement started in 1898 with Callie House and Isaiah Dickerson creating an organization called the National Ex-Slave Mutual Relief Association. Callie House, a native of Nashville, Tennessee, had been born a slave in 1861. Basically got away from slavery by the 13th Amendment. Became a washerwoman. Got the kind of jobs that a lot of the African American women were allowed to have in that time period. Had 5 children. Got widowed at an early age. And then heard information from the church and from the community that there were people trying to establish a way of providing justice for people who had worked for free and had gotten no real benefit out of it. People would say, listen, my father was free from slavery, but then tied to somebody else's land on which he worked for 99 years and died poor. Died without any way of bequeathing land, money, clothing, nothing. He had nothing to bequeath to his family. All he did was work and work and work for somebody else. That is not real freedom. Callie House heard this information and got interested in working with Isaiah Dickerson, who had been an employee of a white man by the name of Walter Vaughn. Vaughn had tried to get Congress to pass legislation that provided funding to the South for pensions for ex-slaves. He didn't want it for the ex-slaves. He wanted Congress to provide the money, send it to the South, and then the South would decide what they want to do with it. Similar to what some people seem to be doing now in 2014. U.S. money provided by Congress to a particular state, but then the state gets a chance to distribute the money and decide who gets it and when they get it. Walter Vaughn wanted that kind of situation, so he actually had tried to get legislation passed which on the surface looked like reparations for former slaves. It was not. Dickerson and Callie House became a partnering unit to try to take that idea and to do something else with it. In fact, they decided that talking to the grassroots, going out knocking on doors, talking to ex-slaves, asking them to pay $1 or $2 for membership in this organization, which would allow petitions to be filled out and presented to the U.S. Congress for money that was related to the pensions that were paid to former Civil War veterans. The U.S. Pensions Board was paying a small stipend, a small pension for those who had survived the Civil War. Callie House and Isaiah Dickerson, based on the idea that Walter Vaughn had tried to pull off, that did not work, had decided that this pension movement, if expanded, could work, particularly if you got a number of community folk to fill out fill out petitions that they could then send in to Congress. And the other part of the idea, quite apart from what Vaughn had talked about, the federal government had seized cotton from the South during the Civil War and during Reconstruction when they had to set up a military government in the South. They had seized cotton from the South, and there had been a tax collected and kept by the U.S. government of $68 million. Callie House and Isaiah Dickerson said that $68 million from the South, that cotton, number one, black people had picked the cotton. Give that $68 million to the ex-slaves. That would be just compensation for the work that they had done that they had never been compensated for. And that would provide the money for the pension for the ex-slaves. From 1898 until 1918, 20 years, the National Ex-Slave Movement pursued this objective of getting money compensation for ex-slaves. They had used the U.S. Post Office to communicate with a lot of the members. In fact, they got up to 300,000 recorded members. This is the first mass movement in the reparations effort in this country. And they, to communicate with a lot of these members, they couldn't go around and knock on 300,000 doors. They used the Postal Service. Well, the pension fund administrators contacted the Postal Service and asked them to stop letting Callie House and Isaiah Dickerson and this organization use the Postal Service. Callie House argued that this was, as an American citizen, she was protected by the First Amendment. So that should not be a problem with using a post office. Anyway, the Postal Service decided on their own that there was fraud being committed, in fact that statement was the Pension Movement Association was exploiting ignorant Negroes and getting them to do what they should not be doing. And because there's a suspicion of you trying to misuse people, you can no longer utilize the Postal Service to do that. So even though they protested, the Postal Service made a decision that the pension fund movement, the ex-slave pension fund movement could not overcome. That decision basically could not be challenged. But they kept on operating. In spite of losing the access to the post office, they kept traveling, knocking on doors, talking to people. Callie House was excellent at that. She was the main recruiter going to every part of rural Tennessee and to other parts of the South to talk to and to convince poor people that this was an option, a viable option that they could use. Eventually, Isaiah Dickerson was charged in Atlanta with fraud, that they were taking money from poor people and not accounting for the money and not spending the money they said that, where they were going to do. Well, Dickerson was convicted, but the conviction was overturned a few months later. Callie House kept working when Dickerson was in trouble, and eventually Callie House herself was charged in court with fraud, with running an organization that was defrauding the American citizens. On the flimsiest of evidence, in fact, they had no real evidence, the government had no evidence, they convicted Callie House of fraud. And without Callie House, who was the heart and soul of the ex-slave pension association, it fell apart. So when she went to jail for a year and then got off on good behavior, but from 1917 to 1918 she was in prison. When she got out, they tried to revive things, and recontact people, but it didn't work. The credibility, the loss of credibility, and the loss of activity that occurred with putting Callie House in prison, and her conviction never got overturned. Dickerson's got overturned, hers did not. This killed the first mass movement for reparations in this country. Throughout the 20th century, we had other individuals stand up and say that African Americans deserved some form of apology, atonement, and compensation for having worked for free. Father Divine, for example, who became very famous in New York for not only having a ministry that talked about money, that talked about moving forward, no matter what the circumstances are, find something positive in it and move forward. Father Divine, who called himself God, had also advocated in his peace mission, international peace mission, that African Americans be compensated for having worked for free, having worked to provide riches and money and property for other people, but who had gotten nothing out of it. The other major early names in keeping this idea of reparations alive included Queen Mother Moore, Queen Mother Audley Moore, who had been born in Louisiana but moved to the north, particularly to New York. Queen Mother Moore, who had known Marcus Garvey, who had been a Garveyite, who had been an early advocate for women's rights, had also connected Garveyism to a push for reparations and had created a committee for reparations for African Americans in the 1950s. Queen Mother Moore remained the major advocate for reparations for African Americans in this country until the publication of Randall Robinson's book, The Debt, which gave another impetus to reparations in the 1980s and 1990s. The other name that has to be mentioned is Reparations Ray Jenkins, a gentleman who had been born and raised in the South, who had seen racism firsthand, who had been the son of a father who had done that process of being confined to a tenant farm or sharecropping situation, who had spent his entire life working for somebody else and died poor, almost homeless, and with nothing to give to the family. Reparations Ray, as he came to be called, moved to Detroit, and choosing a career as a real estate agent, he ended up working with some of the Motown celebrities, trying to help them buy houses, and he also ended up becoming a major influence for Congressman John Conyers. In fact, Reparations Ray was the one who kept egging him on about, you have to do something. We elected you into office. You have to do something about compensation, reparations. We have to have it. We have to have it. In 1988, when the Civil Liberties Act was passed for the Japanese Americans, which apologized to them for the discrimination that the federal government had imposed on mainly the Japanese Americans living in California, Oregon, and Washington state because of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. That particular legislation in 1988 led to John Conyers taking that legislation, having it revised, rewritten as a proposal that has been called H.R. 40. His bill that he has been introducing to Congress since 1989 for a study of what happened to African Americans. and whether in fact they are due some kind of recompense. Reparations Ray was again the main one advocating that, and John Conyers had given Ray Jenkins acknowledgement as being a persistent irritant in his ear to do something, and he did. Now, just about the time that the Civil Liberties Act was passed, an organization called NCOBRA, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, was created. And it was created to take what Reparations Ray had been pushing, or what Queen Mother Moore had been pushing. We have to have an organized effort to get reparations done. So this is another level, rebirth of reparations again in this country. Now, NCOBRA is still alive, is still well, is still pushing the idea that reparations is due and reparations does need to be taken care of. But like H.R. 40, which is constantly being reintroduced every year in Congress since 1989, and NCOBRA every year has an annual convention, and NCOBRA every year pushes out its educational message to keep the idea of reparations alive. It has not really been able to accomplish to win reparations. And NCOBRA has not decided to become the Martin Luther King organization for reparations. It has not decided to become the SNCC organization or the SCLC. NCOBRA has not decided to become the SCLC of the reparations movement, and that's what's needed. Without a group not only championing that effort, but willing to sit down, negotiate, and to get people to do some kind of mass action to basically stay home and not spend their money, to boycott companies that participated in reparations or participated in owning slaves or participated in exploiting black people. Without having an organization ready and willing and organized to do that, reparations has gotten to be just where it is now. We're still working on it, but there does not seem to be a light at the end of the tunnel. The other part of the reparations movement is that at the end of the 1990s, partially pushed by Randall Robinson's book, The Debt, and also pushed by a new generation of people who had understood that African Americans were still being disrespected and pushed around in American society and in other parts of the world, decided that it was time to go back to court and to sue the U.S. government and state governments when they could for having participated in either allowing slavery to be utilized to exploit African Americans, or in some cases to have owned slaves themselves. The United States government, in fact, owned slaves, and a number of states owned slaves as part of their public workforce. Deidre Farmer-Pellman is one of these individuals. She ended up working with a group that had already sued for Jewish reparations, and they decided they would sue the U.S. government and some corporations for their participation in either owning slaves or protecting those who own slaves. The first one she sued was Aetna Insurance Company, and Aetna ended up apologizing, didn't pay any compensation, but apologizing and acknowledging that they should not have participated in that effort. Deidre Farmer-Pellman ended up working or creating a group that advocated what was called corporate restitution, the corporate restitution part of the reparations movement. That is, we will find companies that either owned policies that protected slaveholders, or that bought predecessor companies that had issued policies that protected slaveholders. We will find these companies and we will sue them. They ended up identifying 9 companies and suing them. And they ended up with, in federal court, U.S. federal court. In 2002, the federal court collected all of these cases together and dismissed them. Said that the people suing did not have standing. Not one of you were a slave, and not one of you can demonstrate any connection to any slave who had been insured by one of these companies. So the case was dismissed with prejudice in 2002 at the U.S. District Court level. It was appealed, and then in 2006, that dismissal was reversed. The cases were said to still be viable, because now we would have the cases would be put on suspension without prejudice. If you want to bring the cases back and re-adjudicate them, you could do that once you had dealt with several requirements. You would have to find a specific law that had been violated in terms of moving slaves from one place to another. You would have to be able to establish a direct tie to somebody, to some slave who was treated that way. You would have to be able to lay out a relationship between a company that had been involved in this and be able to identify some economic advantage that company got, some economic disadvantage that the slave or the slave's family had gotten. Anyway, there were a set of requirements that had to be fulfilled in order to bring the cases back, but at least the cases got saved from the garbage heap, and they have not been re-adjudicated at this point. The other part of the reparations movement got a thrust forward when the World Conference Against Racism got organized by the United Nations and implemented in South Africa in 2001. At that gathering, there had been long, heated, and fruitful negotiations about having a part of the eventual declaration from that conference with the phraseology that slavery and the slave trade are crimes against humanity and should have always been seen as crimes against humanity. Now, getting that phraseology into the final document for the World Conference Against Racism was a jump start to community organizing about reparations, so that we got, after the World Conference, about 15 states that wrote legislation apologizing for slavery and for saying that any company working within the confines of the state which had owned slaves, or which had any company which had bought predecessor companies that had owned slaves, may be subject to a legal suit and may be subject to having to pay some kind of compensation. California, for example, passed legislation in 2000 that said insurance companies that had operated in California that had sold policies that dealt with slaves had to be listed. So California did a research to establish a database of insurance companies that basically had some monetary relationship to slaves and slaveholders. That was one of the last bills that State Senator Tom Hayden had sponsored and gotten passed before he left the state legislature. The city of LA, along with Chicago and Philadelphia and Washington, D.C., had also passed legislation that said that any company which can be shown to have profited from slavery or had bought any companies that had profited from slavery had to fill out a form saying that. And if you did not fill out a form and were later found out to have misinformed the public, you could be sued. That legislation got passed in LA and in Oakland, California, and it's still on the books. So this whole legal framework, trying to pass legislation or trying to take people directly to court, became a favorite weapon of the reparations activists in this new iteration, in this new version of reparations. A group called the Reparations Coordinating Committee that had essentially grown out of Deidre Farmer Pellman's relationship to Aetna and then her trying to sue some other insurance companies, became a group of very well-known African-American lawyers. In fact, some of the very, very best African-American lawyers in the country joined the Reparations Coordinating Committee. Johnny Cochran, before he passed, was one of them. And that committee was supposed to lay out a legal strategy for taking on reparations opponents. They were supposed to lay out a legal strategy about corporations. They were supposed to lay out a legal strategy for dealing with governments, state governments, local governments, and the United States government. For example, that group, the Reparations Coordinating Committee, was supposed to work on what we consider to be the Brown versus Board of Education case at the for the reparations issue, and that was the Tulsa, Oklahoma Greenwood case. Greenwood was the area right outside of Tulsa, Oklahoma, a suburb of Tulsa, that had become a very, very successful black township. The citizens there had, doctors, lawyers, dentists. I mean, they had very, very good homes. The quality of life in that area was very, very high, and they were all black. The white citizenry of Tulsa got irritated with that, created a subterfuge, a distraction, accused a black man of raping a white woman, which generally always worked to get white people crazy. And they attacked Greenwood and looking for the young man. And the black population wouldn't go for that. They would not allow whites to just come in and snatch a black citizen and lynch him. Lynching was still going on in that time period, 20 and 21. The young man was eventually arrested and held in jail, and the whites attacked the jail so they could drag him out and lynch him, and blacks fought that. And in the expansion of the fighting, whites attacked Greenwood and burned most of it to the ground, and had the National Guard come in and bomb the Greenwood, Oklahoma township. They had basically acted as they had acted in Rosewood and other black townships that had shown the way to black success. It always seemed to irritate the surrounding white population, and they would decimate the township. And that's what they had done in Greenwood. In a way, there were living descendants of that engagement. There were living descendants of the people who had gotten killed, who had lost their houses, who had lost their businesses. John Hope Franklin, the dean of African American historians, was one of them. He had been in Greenwood during that time as a report. Anyway, we had about 100 to 125 living descendants. So the issue of not having standing was a non-issue in this case. Not having standing had been an issue in almost every other reparations case that we had tried to bring to court. And there have been about 125 reparations cases that have been brought into court. And each and every one of them had been dismissed or had been lost based on lack of standing. This one, you had people who had been there, who had seen what had happened. They were still alive. So this was seen as being our best chance to get a major legal victory. Anyway, all of this occurred in 20 and 21. And when the case was brought into the federal court system in 2000, I think in 2003, 2004, the initial adjudication had been this case had merit and it would move on. And so at the next level, once the Tulsa appealed, they lost because the federal court said, you don't have standing. Well, what do you mean we don't have standing when we have all these people who were there? No, you don't have standing because of statute of limitations. This happened in 1921. Why are you just bringing this in 2002, 2003? Well, in 1921, 22, black folk could not complain to the federal government. There was no way of getting any local or state action on this issue. And the state was involved in the event in the first place. They were bombing. They helped bomb the township. The National Guard was involved in bombing the township. We know this because there had been a study, Tulsa, Oklahoma, city of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and the state of Oklahoma had paid for a commission to study the event. So they had a lot of evidence. They knew where the bodies were buried, they knew who had done what, they knew who had been involved. But they had also said, once we finish the study, you can't do anything with it. So we'll give you a statue in the park to commemorate it, but that's all we're going to do. So the federal court had said, no, you cannot sue based on this evidence because you should have filed when there was the time period to file. The time period to file for that was 2 years. So it would have been, you would have to have filed in 1923. And the lawyers just looked at the judge and said, that's not even possible. African Americans could not sue at that time. African Americans were not even being allowed to testify in court. Well, the judge said there was a 1969 article that came out by a scholar in Oklahoma, which reinvestigated the case. When that 1969 article came out, you should have filed then. You should have filed a suit then. Anyway, the statute of limitations prohibits you from pursuing this case. Well, the Reparations Coordinating Committee lawyers appealed. They appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. As the court was considering whether to hear the case or not, the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court was home sick. And as I understand it, the information that we've been provided is that he got out of his sick bed. He was almost deathly sick. Got out of his sick bed, came back to the court to be able to register his vote, not to hear the case. So the case was essentially not heard by the U.S. Supreme Court. And so that last federal court decision, which dismissed it, is still the one that is current. So the biggest case that we had that we thought would give us a real reparation victory was not successful. The other part of this new reparations thrust, we call it the 20th century reparations thrust, has been, again, grassroots movements. There have been organizations like the Reparations United Front and in Cobra all over the country. They've had repeated meetings, they've had repeated gatherings, they've had repeated canvassing opportunities, but reparations has still not been successful. It has not been won in the United States. H.R. 40 has still not ever gotten out of the committee. It's never gotten a full House vote because it's never gotten out of the Judiciary Committee, where John Conyers is. It's never even gotten a vote in the Judiciary Committee, even when John Conyers was the chair of the committee during the Clinton administration when the Democrats had the majority vote in the House of Representatives. It never got a full vote by the committee and never got to the House floor. So the legal approach has not thus far been successful, even though there have been a number of attempts. The grassroots effort has gotten a lot of individual stuff done, but again, there's been no collective effort. We've had the state of Illinois to do a full-scale study of slavery and the Underground Railroad and everything else in Illinois, and whether African Americans deserve some kind of compensation. They finished theirs. We have not had a statewide study like that in California. We've not had it in most other states either. So we have not collectivized the efforts. There is right now no national reparations plan or even a regional reparations plan to be able to move along toward victory. And that is a major problem of the reparations movement in the United States. Now there's an international reparations movement that what is going on in this country has always been a part of. And recently that international reparations movement has taken a major step in April, in the late spring, early summer of 2013. CARICOM, which is the acronym for the Caribbean Community Economic Community. CARICOM, 15 countries in CARICOM decided to join the international reparations movement and to sue France, England, the Netherlands, and possibly Denmark for bringing African Americans, bringing Africans from the continent to do slave labor in the Caribbean. So 15 Caribbean countries, including Barbados, Jamaica, Antigua, the Grenadines, basically have said that they are going to collectivize their efforts, their economic expertise, and their legal expertise, and join the international movement that is suing these European countries for having, as Walter Rodney, the great African scholar, said, for having impoverished Africans so that they could enrich Europeans. They exploited the labor, did not pay them, made all the profits from sugar, made all the profits from other Caribbean products, which made Europeans wealthy, which made France and England wealthy, but which made and maintained African-oriented societies in the Caribbean areas poor. That kind of relationship needs to be compensated for. That kind of relationship needs to be accounted for. So anyway, the international reparations movement has been growing stronger. Partially, it got a thrust forward by the settlement that was just announced a month or so ago between the descendants of the Kikuyu Mau Mau group in Kenya with the British government. The British Parliament had to apologize and pay compensation because during the anti-colonial struggle in Kenya, this organization called the Mau Mau, which was a group of indigenous Kenyans fighting the British police, the British military, had been massacred, had been raped, had been tortured, had been treated in very bad fashion. They had basically violated, the British had violated rules of civilized combat, rules of civilized behavior. The Mau Mau took the British to court, and again, a month or so ago, the decision was made by a British court that the British government had in fact violated human rights of the Mau, and so they would have to be paid. Those who are still alive and their descendants would have to be paid. Also, there's a group called the Kulamani Group out of South Africa, which had sued in U.S. court based on a 19th century tort opportunity, which allowed foreign entities to sue in U.S. courts for activities by U.S. companies and foreign companies. So the Kulamani Group had sued Barclays Bank, General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, and about 15 other corporations for their support of apartheid activities in South Africa, that they had supported buying military weaponry that was used to torture Africans in South Africa during apartheid. General Motors settled that part of the case. The other companies, the other corporations are still being sued. The case is not dead. The case is dormant right now. It's not dead. But General Motors decided to settle, and so it paid a bunch of money to the Kulamani Group. Those two were seen as being great victories that moved the international reparations movement forward. And again, the national reparations movement is tied to what the international community has been doing, although they don't seem to be following more than the legal path. And to be frank about it, for reparations to be achieved in the United States, following a legal pathway is not enough. Without the community organizations and their efforts, there will not be a reparations victory in this country. It will not occur through just going to court. It will not occur just through going to the legislature. In fact, as an example of this, in 2008, the U.S. House of Representatives passed a resolution apologizing for slavery and for some of the consequences of slavery, like Jim Crowism and racial separation, the Plessy versus Ferguson case, etc. And because we did not have a plan for reparations, because we did not have a laid out pathway, all most of the reparations forces in this country did was to downgrade, to criticize, to ignore that resolution and just say, no, that apology is not enough. That's almost a waste of our time. You are insulting our intelligence. We don't want an apology. We want more than that. A year and a half later, the U.S. Senate passed an even stronger resolution. In fact, the strongest legal or legislative resolution we've ever had in this country about reparations. They said that the U.S. Senate apologizes for the American people, not only for slavery, but for Jim Crow and for all racial discrimination that has occurred in this country implemented by whites against blacks. I mean, it was the most comprehensive resolution we've ever seen. And again, because the reparation forces in this country were not united on a particular pathway, it was rejected. That resolution was ignored, so you cannot count either the resolution from the House of Representatives or the U.S. Senate resolution as small victories along the pathway toward an eventual complete reparations victory. This is completely unlike what happened with the Japanese Americans, who eventually got their Civil Liberties Act. They counted small victories along the way until they finally got the larger victory. That is a major problem within the national reparations movement. But again, because the movement for African American reparations is tied to the international reparations movement, maybe internationally we'll be pulled up to another level. That essentially is the history of the reparations movement in this country. It is still alive, it's not well. It is still waiting for another cyclical boost upward. We've had ups and downs throughout the history of the reparations movement in this country. It right now has been officially tied to 21st century Pan-Africanism. The Pan-African movement and reparations movement are now intimately connected. That occurred at the most recent meeting of the 8th Pan-African Congress in South Africa, where the gathered delegates voted to make sure those two were intimately connected. Now that will, while that is a great movement forward, it's also one that will bring a number of other issues in. Number one, the issue of the Arab slave trade, which came before the European slave trade. There's never really been an involvement of the consequences of the Arab slave trade in the reparations movement, and now that will occur. You also still have the issue of African countries and African ethnic groups who participated in selling Africans into the slave trade, who basically participated in selling Africans into slavery. That still has to be dealt with too. But because the reparations movement has now been tied intimately to 21st century Pan-Africanism, particularly the part that deals with repatriation, the right of return, the issue of dealing with the African diaspora as part of the accomplishment of the unification of the continent. All of these are new frontiers that will have to be fully explored, and in the interim, we expect the national reparations movement to be re-engaged and to be re-energized. Out of all of this, there must come a strategic plan forward, or there will be no victory. That is where the reparations movement now lies. That is where it is as we speak.
Why did you call 40 Acres and a Mule a myth?
A distinct part of African American culture, that is a distinct part of what we are taught as part of our understanding of the black experience, is that elements of the American government promised to provide 40 acres of land to heads of African American families, and possibly the use of some mules to help to work that land. That promise was made and then broken, and that part of reparations is that now you owe us to make good on that promise. Well, actually, the promise was never made. 40 acres and a mule is generally based on General Sherman's Field Order 15 that was issued in 1865. That military decision made in the field as Sherman was moving through the South trying to burn as many places as he could to force the Confederacy into submission, came about because wherever Sherman's forces went, African Americans would leave the plantations or would leave wherever they had been confined to work and try to follow Sherman's troops. By the beginning of 1865, when they were in South Carolina, about 40,000 or so of these African American families had tried to basically attach themselves to Sherman's army moving through. Sherman said this was a danger, this is a threat to his own forces. He was not there to provide cover or to provide support for escaping slaves he was there to win an award. They sat down and had a meeting with about 30 of the leaders from that group, and the results of that meeting, in terms of asking, what do you want me to do? What do you want from me? I'm a military commander in the field. What do you want from me? They had asked, the 30 leaders had asked for land, they had asked for some protection for their freedoms that they thought they had now gotten from Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. And Sherman said, okay, here's what I can do. There's a bunch of confiscated land that we have from the Confederates, land that they've abandoned to go off and fight. And the government has collectivized a lot of that land in South Carolina and Georgia and in Florida. You can have that land. You can possess that land, you can grow on it, you can work on it. That would fill Order 15, that here's land that you can work on, you can have, you can possess. Field Order 15 could not give them legal ownership of that land. Sherman didn't have that kind of authority, but he did allow them to possess it. So about 40,000 African Americans moved into land in Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida. Lincoln said no. Lincoln basically said, you don't have the authority to do this, and basically he had overruled Sherman, but had not made people move. After Lincoln got assassinated in April of 1865, the vice president who became president, Andrew Johnson, immediately countermanded Sherman's order and told the African Americans who had moved on the land to get off, that the Southerners were coming back to take their land, that the Southerners owned the land, all of the African Americans who've been on it, occupying and squatting on it, get off. And for most of that land that we had in Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida, we had to leave. We did not leave most of the coastal islands of South Carolina, what we call the seacoast, where the Gullah Geechee lived. Most of those we stayed on because they couldn't come and make us move. Anyway, that is what most of the 40 Acres and a Mule myth is based on, Sherman's Field Order 15. There are others who say that Thaddeus Stevens, a very, very strong ally of African Americans, as a member of the House of Representatives, had tried to pass a bill that provided 40 acres and a mule to all African American adults, and there was no mules or any kind of other implements in it. You get access to 40 acres if you're head of a household, and that the government passed that legislation but never enforced it. Well, Thaddeus Stevens did write legislation for that. That was the initial legislation for the Freedmen's Bureau. Lincoln killed that. Lincoln and his moderate Republicans said that's far too radical. So in the interim between congressional sessions, they rewrote what Thaddeus Stevens had tried to propose, and the milder version of that legislation was passed as the Freedmen's Bureau Act. It took out any land being given to African Americans. There has never been a promise by the federal government, by Congress, or by the president that African Americans will be given free land. And then that promise broken. So the 40 acres and a mule is a myth. It never happened. Now there were numerous instances of land being given away to Americans, to poor Americans. They had all kinds of resettlement acts. But every time that occurred, African Americans were either kept away or denied access. If you could not sign your name on a piece of paper saying that you had actually settled or you had claimed a piece of land, then you would not be allowed to have the land. A lot of African Americans were uneducated, they could only sign an X. That wasn't good enough. So in all the 19th century attempts to redistribute land to a lot of poor Americans. We were not part of that. African Americans were not promised 40 acres and a mule. We were not promised any land, and we didn't get it. That's what I mean about it. It's a myth. I mean, it's nice and it's useful, and we have used it in a lot of like the HR 40 legislation that John Conyers has tried to pass, and Spike Lee has named his production company 40 acres and a mule. But again, they never made a promise that they broke. Not that one anyway. They made a bunch of other promises. They never made that promise that they broke. That's part and parcel of, we need to, it's time for at least one book, if not a series of books, on the mythology in African American history. We have gone far enough in our research accomplishments and research capabilities so that the Gloriana history that a lot of us did early on in when we were creating Black Studies departments and programs, we don't need that now. We can actually talk about the beauty and the ugliness of what did happen, what did not happen. We can talk about our relationship to the Native Americans. We can talk about when it was good and when it was bad. We can talk about when we were absolutely a part of major contributions and when we were not. We can talk about what inventions we actually provided and what inventions we simply copied what was already there. We need to be able to have a revisiting of African American history so that it is a lot more accurate than we were able to make it a few years ago. And that would be the first thing to go. The 40 acres and a mule myth has to go.
What was the role of the Freedoms Bureau in general and Freedoms Bank more specifically during the Reconstruction period?
The Freedmen's Bureau, created in the legislation in 1865, was set up as America's first real welfare agency. This was supposed to help provide some economic support for Americans, not just for blacks, but for farmers who had been dispossessed, whites who had been soldiers who now had been released from their command. This was to help poor people, refugees, indigent folk who needed medical care. This was supposed to help provide an economic floor for aiding those who had been damaged by war. Included in that group were African Americans. So the Freedmen's Bureau was actually set up to seek out and find those who desperately needed help, either in terms of getting a home, getting a job, getting clothing, getting medical service. Out of the Freedmen's Bureau Act came something specifically for African Americans, and that was the Freedmen's Bank. That we would establish this financial institution which would allow African Americans to learn thrift, to learn how to save their meager earnings so that they could do like regular Americans. They could then borrow against that. They could use it to buy homes, that type of thing. The Freedmen's Bureau Bank, the Freedmen's Bank was a very good idea, just badly implemented. They put people in charge who either didn't understand banks or we just saw a way to steal money. So although a lot of African Americans started bank accounts and put money in fact, the bank was at one time said to have held $30 million in financial resources put in by African Americans, and all that money disappeared. Frederick Douglass for a while had been associated with the Freedmen's Bank, but he was never in charge of it. And General Howard, who was the namesake for Howard University, had been in charge of it. we have not yet done enough research to identify who was responsible for what part of the disappearance of the money, but we do know that a lot of African Americans put their money in, and a lot of them lost their money. This is a bad financial venture for most of them. Not because the legislation did not set something up that would have been very beneficial, but the way it got translated was not handled well. There's another example of the federal government sometimes being too big for its own projects. You can set something up but not really follow through on making sure it goes well. Then again, the failure of the Freedmen's Bank was one of the reasons that Callie House and Isaiah Dickerson created the National Ex-Slave Mutual Relief Association. There had been nothing that had come from the federal government that had actually helped create an environment for Southern black folk to become economically self-sustaining. They had to do something about that. And so the failure of the Freedmen's Bank, you can say, led to the creation of that first mass organization for reparations. But we still need to do more research on the Freedmen's Bank. We actually somebody needs to create a research committee or research commission, or a number of students need to do their dissertation proposals to focus on that. There needs to be much more rigorous, meticulous research on what happened with the Freedmen's Bank. And can there be some way of asking for compensation even after all this time for the money that got stolen, for the property that got misused? How do you take funds from poor people, people who are already dealing with a lack of resources? How do you take funds from them and steal it? How do you do that? And the government was involved in that and needs to be held accountable for it.
What role did the NAACP play in the reparations movement?
The NAACP, during part of its history, was very supportive of the reparations effort. They too thought that the government had essentially set African Americans free without any support for them to be able to survive. Basically, it's almost like you just release everything on the farm, you're off on your own. And so the NAACP during the 1950s did support, although did not get actively involved in the reparations effort. Now, ever since Randall Robinson's The Debt came out, early 1990s, the NAACP has utilized local political action committees. Those political action committees in parts of the country have decided to focus on reparations as they did here in Los Angeles. The political action committee in LA, particularly the one that was the Hollywood branch, has done a number of town halls, has gotten some projects funded based on their interest in reparations. They were very, very involved in trying to get the LA City Council to pass the resolution supporting the state legislation about insurance companies that had participated in slavery. So the local political action committees within the NAACP have been very good, some of them in pushing reparations, but the national office, except that one time in the 1950s, has not really been that interested in reparations, nor have they been that interested in black businesses and entrepreneurship. It's been the legal fight to change the status of African Americans legally in this country that they've been more interested in, and the educational fight. Now, you know that the NAACP, a Legal Defense Fund, is not really a part of the NAACP anymore. It's a separate organization. So the Legal Defense Fund was communicated with. They were asked to join the Reparations Coordinating Committee's legal fight against Tulsa, Oklahoma, and some of the other cities and corporations that had been identified as having discriminated against black folks. And some of the attorneys in the Legal Defense Fund have been involved with those cases. The mainstream NAACP, however, just has not done that. Locally, committees have dealt with economic issues, but nationally, economics have been the image awards. That's essentially been the national NAACP's interest in the black economics.
Is reparations only about slavery?
Yes and no. The reparations movement has focused on the consequences growing out of slavery more than any other foundation. Originally, they had included the slave trade and slavery. And again, at the very beginning, I had indicated that modern maturity in the reparations movement has made a lot of us understand you cannot have a movement against the ma'afa, the slave trade, and slavery at the same time. All you can do is confuse matters so you can't get anything accomplished. In terms of identifying the foundation for the unjust enrichment, which is the core concept for reparations, that comes out of slavery. But when you talk about the history of African Americans and their creation of black townships and having those townships destroyed when they became successful, Allentown, or Allensworth, even in California, for example, then those two are involved in the conversation for reparations. The Tulsa, Oklahoma Greenwood case was not about slavery. It was about a successful township that got wiped out because whites just simply got jealous. How dare you black people become successful, more successful than we are? That was not about slavery. So in terms of its foundational origins, the reparations movement relies on the consequences of slavery, but there are other parts of the equation that you have to expand to as you get more deeply involved in it. So it starts in slavery, but it does not. That's not where it ends.